idea. I think that's the opposite of what everybody does.
Most people did.
Is it?
I was writing my paper and I got to 2 pages and I was like, I'm not even close to where
Yeah, no, I was like 3/4 down my second page. I'm like, I still have like a paragraph plan.
Yeah,
I gotta wrap this up.
I'm not sure how.
That was a good idea.
I think that was a super good idea, because yeah, we keep people presentations and then you can tell they were their paper after and you can just drop off.
Right.
That was a really
Yeah, no, my
good
last
way of
paragraph
doing
is just like an immediate cutoff because I realized I was at the bottom of the page.
it. I'm done. That's all.
I gotta go in too. Oh, are we presenting from our desk?
I'm just making. You can do it however you want, because I'm logged on up there, so you can use it to get to your stuff, or you can remote control your computer from up there, or however you would like to do it. Now, what I did this morning is I just timed everybody. Now, I didn't stop them if they went over, and we did. We had a couple of people who were probably like 18 or 20 minutes. So if you guys feel like those people need to be told, you know, start going or whatever you want to do, but I'm not going to cut anybody off because we didn't have such interesting stuff. I'll knock them a few points for going over those. Nothing bad.
Feels like we may go under.
If they go under, it's a little bit more adopted.
What happened to your car?
Oh, yeah.
I don't care about my computer audio.
No, I am going down. I volunteered. What? My car slid off into the ditch.
I was thinking just left.
I see your car, it's not a truck by any means.
So did you drive right out of the
Computer audio? No. Drawing with computer audio.
But it, so it was probably that.
You just need to get a test live, those are real good ones.
What is it?
A test live.
Mine is like,
I think I'm 40. Go drop $40,000.
Like my car here, all of a sudden it's like, slam on the brakes this time. I feel your stress.
mine is adaptive braking, so it does automatically experiment with the
Yes.
braking around based on how heavy it is. And I hate it.
How did that work out? Right into the ditch. Huh? That's how it is. Yep. Okay, you can go ahead.
Okie dokie.
Kristen will probably be here soon, so don't let it bother you. Kristen, don't let it bother you. He's Christian. He's those two named people.
I'll just stand back here because I don't want to go up there.
No, it says you have
That's
to.
not the rule.
You said I could do it how I want.
As far as your communication of computers, yourself will be up there.
Okay.
I tell him he can do something and you just like create something really new here.
I listen to you how I want to hear you.
I have faith in you.
Someone put something on the machine that they don't like, or I don't know, they just keep reading it.
I requested remote control. Whenever you like accept that.
I can do it.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ethan, and this is my presentation on why C# is easy to and is worth learning. So, okay. So WT flip is C#. Now, C# is something that we all should know because we are in C# too, after all. But in case you don't know and you haven't been paying attention to Renee all the past year or so, C# is a C-based programming language, and C is just referring to the type of syntax it uses. It uses a .NET framework, which is a software made by Microsoft that primarily runs on Windows. It's mostly used to develop Windows applications, but through my research, I found that it can be used to develop pretty much anything you want. Brief history of it. It was made back in 1999, the year before Y2K, and it was made during the development of the .NET framework by Microsoft, which is why it's so closely tied with them. So what makes it easy to learn exactly? C#, as you know from class, is relatively easy to read, and many of the complex tasks that you do in programming languages are done in the background. It is also statically typed, which means that the code is checked before it is actually made into an application. Now this makes it easy to debug. Those are like the errors we see in Visual Studio saying, hey, we can't compile it, there's build errors. And all of this makes it easy to get the hang of. All right, so that image looked a lot better on a smaller screen. What are some benefits of having C#? Well, first of all, it is very versatile. It can be used, there are many things that it can be used for, such as mobile applications, desktop applications, cloud-based services, websites, enterprise software, and even some games. Going back to some of the versatility, we've recently been using it with SQL Studio, and it really helps making programs that access databases, as our past few projects have been. So another benefit of it is it's easy to learn, as I've gone through before. It's real easy to follow and all that. And another benefit is lots of people use it. So when you're learning it, or when you are having trouble with it, lots of people using it means you have hundreds, if not thousands, of resources out there that you can reference. And that is a huge benefit, especially if you can't figure out what's wrong with your program. So are there any other benefits? Yeah, of course there are. I still have some time left to kill in this presentation. It's very much in demand. So if you're certified in C#, you're going to have an easier time finding a job than if you're certified in Python, for example. According to TIO Programming Index, it is the 5th most in-demand language in the world. And the other top 5 I saw were like Java and C++. So if you know one of those, you know all 3 pretty much, just a few syntax differences. The big company, you might have heard of it, Microsoft, they back C#. So if Microsoft fails, which I don't see them doing, then C# is kind of screwed. But another benefit of it is used in Unity game development. As I mentioned before, it can be used in game development, and it can also be used cross-platform between like Windows and Mac OS. So is it really worth learning? Well, yeah, that's kind of the point of why I'm standing up here talking to you. Okay, but why is it worth learning? So this boils down to, it's easy to learn, it's very versatile. Again, you have thousands of resources out there if you are in trouble, and it is in demand. So let's look at some examples of code. This is just basic C# code I threw together for the purpose of this. You got your classic little hello world program that even if you don't know programming C#, you can still tell, hey, this is going to output hello world in some way. And it would output something in a console like this. Then you get into methods where you can have reusable code, and that's really interesting and really beneficial to purposes of coding. And then you get into Windows forms, which is the thing we've been doing for the past semester and a half or so. The Windows forms are really easy to use, and then again, SQL databases. So any questions?
You went through your family real quick.
Yeah, I did.
Good question.
Yeah.
Was one of those top 5 languages SQL? Do you remember?
I don't remember. I can go
A lot
look.
of times it is, and I don't think
I feel like it's definitely up there.
but they usually don't put it in those lists, and it's not really a programming language. They get counted.
I would kind of
So
count
I
it
don't
as. I would kind of count it. Yeah.
Because I guess it's a language you've got.
It's kind of like a pseudo language. You had a question?
Yeah, so like C# was made by Microsoft, and like everything we're doing on Visual Studio is Microsoft runtime and everything, all that.
Right.
So there's like non-Microsoft C# like
There's.
we do those programming websites. It's like a different compiler.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. There's other stuff, but primarily C# was made and is backed by Microsoft, and we've been using the .NET, so figured might as well talk about that. Anything else?
They questioned you enough to get your time up there. Okay, so that's going to be too quick. A second.
Gee, my insurance company just sent me things saying the weather's bad out there.
Whoa, that's
Be
nice.
careful.
I wish they did that.
You know, once you get it ready.
Oh, good job. Yeah, you did. I noticed it too.
I'm trying to help you to do it right.
Okay, I'll just take this off.
There you go. Let's help you.
How do I get?
You have the blue, the green one at the top.
I really got underrated.
Down there.
Yeah,
You
you
up?
said you were executive for giving a presentation, and so.
Okay.
I was gonna say nobody in here has, but we do have. They always get mad at me.
You should be able to do it now.
Give them a hint, give them a hint. Okay.
So my name's Mihaela, and today I'll be talking about how C# and Visual Studio, when combined, enhance the video game process from start to finish. Before knowing how C# and Visual Studio enhance the video game process, you have to understand what the video game process is.
You actually make forms that for this?
Yes, I did. So it can be split up into 5 parts, starting with the idea, wireframe, design, realization or code, and then the launch. Out of these, the idea and the rest of it, specifically the idea, does not have to do with C# or Visual Studio, but because it's a step, I do have a button for it. And my idea was I'm going to make an awesome program for my presentation with buttons to replace the slides in the presentation software. The second step, as I mentioned, was the wireframe. And what's really interesting about Visual Studio is that specifically, you don't have to have any coding experience at all. It offers a drag and drop system. So here I put down how I wanted the title where it was, the image box, and the 5 buttons. And thankfully, C# isn't really difficult to learn anyway. So if you go into the properties and you might not know any code at all you have to do is check the name of the button and then what property you're wanting to adjust. So you would have to do it as name.property equals, and then if it's a Boolean, you're gonna want true or false. If it's a color, you're just gonna type in the color. But one thing that you will always have to remember, whether you know C# or not, is that sometimes you are better off going online and looking for the color HTML, so you can do the hashtag and then the number associated with it, because if you actually type in red is not in Visual Studio, maroon is. So that's one thing that you have to remember whenever you're adjusting stuff, which plays a big role in the design portion. So I was able to do a lot of designing without even touching actual code before I made this program. One of the main things was I adjusted the font size of my label at the top, which is the title. And it's actually 3 labels. So the first 2, I was able to drag across both of them and give them both the exact same font size. And then I went to label 3, which is labeled start to finish, and I made it a separate font size. So the other perk of this is too, and this is just a much bigger perk for people who don't know C# code at all, is that they can literally just double click on a label and input the information I told you earlier, like name dot property equals. So next is the realization or code, so as you can see, I did not debug it perfectly, but that step would have been the realization or code, which I've gone over a little bit with you guys. If you double click on a button on a label, whatever it may be, which you can find all of those in Visual Studio's toolbox, you can create what's called a function and then put all the code inside of it. After that is the launching process. And I personally have never launched anything except to TFS, which doesn't make it go on the internet. But what's great about Visual Studio and C# combined is that not only can front-end developers work with it, back-end developers can work with it as well. And because it's on TFS or even GitHub, everybody can see as it's changing by the minute. So every time you upload a change, everybody will get a notification and they'll all be able to check it out. Any questions?
So, I mean, you were talking about how easy it is to use C# and Visual Studio. That's basically it's for a beginner. What are like the things you think a beginner should know before they actually, like, what is like the base level knowledge of programming that you think someone should do before they actually start jumping into Visual Studio? Or should they just jump in without knowing?
As funny as it sounds, I think when Visual Studio and C# are combined, I don't think they actually need to know code because they give you such great documentation on the website. They allow you to, like I said, you can go ahead and see where all of these properties are and adjust them. And when you double click on something, you can add a piece of code super easily. So I don't really think they need the base of coding unless they aren't using Visual Studio. So if they're doing it out of Notepad, then they would need probably basic HTML training first before they even touched C#. Any other questions? Well, thank you for listening. And I think I'm off my computer at the end. Sorry.
Just completely blank.
I know I'm gonna have to pay for a new backpack for him because I'm vandalizing all this stuff over there. How much do I owe you?
Well, that's a good vintage backpack, so that's like kind of irreplaceable actually.
Don't forget sentimental dog.
Oh yeah, you can sue for that, can't you? If you sue for emotional damage.
Yes, you can.
It's what usually getting look at it.
Yeah, yes.
That was your great grandmother's backpack.
It's my brother's backpack, but still.
There's not that much sentimental value. Brother, grandmother.
Yeah.
I don't
I
see
have
it.
to use the arrow keys on the keyboard.
Is that thing in touchscreen? You just like tap it.
It is touchscreen.
It is, it does not work.
Is it like, is the dongle plugged in?
Click on this thing.
No.
Oh, did it do it? Yeah. Sorry about that.
Sorry, you can't do your presentation now, you're late.
But Kristen came in, so it was good. It was good. To get him situated so he doesn't have to worry.
They have a little bit.
Am I good?
I think you're good.
All right, so I decided to do my presentation over the introduction of C# whenever it was first created. Some of the C# itself was released in 2002, and some of the topics I'll be talking about is who was the founder of C#, some of the designs for C# and what they had like envisioned for it, and some of the people's first reaction whenever they saw it. So the founder was Anders Hellberg. He worked. He was the founder of C#. He was an architect for J++ development and for the Windows Foundation classes. And as he was working doing those development for the architect, he was working and he realized that there was this void between C++ and like Visual Basics. That there's very complex language and very, very basic language. And so he saw a need for something in the middle. And that void he saw as an opportunity to create what is now known as C#. A kind of cool fact that as I was listening to an interview that he had recently on May 6th, was that he almost called the language cesium instead of C#, but then he realized all the properties of cesium and how it's not any good. He figured that C# would be the better way to go. And an interesting statement that he made during that interview was that while he's working on language, he's worked on multiple languages. He's still working on languages today. And he said that you can always put something in a language, but you can't really ever take that back out. And the design for the language, was it radically new at the time? Not really. It was based off of C, C++, and Java, and it honestly looked a lot like Java whenever the first version came out. The goals for the design, as stated by the EMCA, or the Enterprise Manager Configuration Assistant, was that the new language needed to be more modern or more simple and a general purpose object-oriented language. And of course, at the very beginning, it wasn't going to be perfect. There's going to be a lot of bugs. There's going to be a lot of design changes that needed to be made, which a lot of that happened in the second version of C#. And some of the reaction from the very first people that were looking into C# was they kind of just, it looked a lot like Java. And people have complained about it that it really wasn't much different, but there's still a difference in the complexity in which people did enjoy. And compared to what we have today, features were quite limited, and it wasn't quite what some people were looking for. And it wasn't until version 2 and 3 that people really started to see a bigger difference. In the first version, it only had just the basic versions, which were very similar to Java, which has just classes, struct, interfaces, and stuff like that. Version 2 is when you started to see a much major differences in what Java was and what C# was, and it was released in 2005. In 2007, version 3, it really started to pull itself apart from what Java was and is now, and you can see a much clearer design change or design language difference. And that is all.
Kristen?
Do you have any idea like how long it took him from the idea when he's like, I'm gonna start working on a programming language to when he came out with version 1?
Well, during the interview, he actually was stating that most of the languages are actually built on top of another language. So he built it on top of C, C++, and Java. So he just kind of built it on top of that. And I'm not entirely sure how long it took him, but he has built quite a few other different languages on top. So I'm sure it probably does take quite a while. And he has a whole team for it as well. So they work together and talk about it, discuss design choices, discuss features that the program should have and stuff like that.
Does he still work at Microsoft?
I'm not entirely sure. I know he's working on TypeScript right now.
So hard to say.
Probably. So he said that he still goes into the C# kind of place, but he doesn't work on a day-to-day. He just kind of goes in there, kind of like approves it and says, yeah, that sounds like a good thing, or disapproves, like, nah. Any other question?
You know the other languages he worked on?
Yes. He worked on I do know he worked on TypeScript, and before that he was working on, before C#, as I mentioned, it was J++ and Windows Foundation. Do you still have a question? No.
It's the exact same as his.
All right, thank you. Yeah, Microsoft was suffering for a really long time because of object-oriented programming. They kept saying that Visual Basic is object-oriented, and there were ways that you could use it, that you could sort of make it be that, but it wasn't really classes and stuff. So it was kind of going around the bend to make it object-oriented, because in a way me and Jay could tell you guys COBOL is object-oriented.
Oh, yeah.
Depending on how you write it. But so people kept disagreeing with Microsoft on that assessment, and they were losing more and more developers for not having an object-oriented programming language. They had like J++ and J#, and they kept coming out with these J ones that I think was our short name for Java, and they weren't getting in anywhere with that, so they decided to go to C. Very interesting. Let's see who we have next is Austin.
Which one of us?
He's got it, he knows. He's ready.
That's me. I'm ready. Say first before I see.
Now that clicky thing will work up there if you click on your screen up here. Control.
What do I do with it? This clicky thing?
Just click on your screen, and then you should be able to go forward and back.
All right.
See if it'll work.
And you have to take control.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ethan, could you hit the remote control? Thank you. All right.
I'll click on the
On the screen.
Oh, this screen. Gotcha.
All these things are good way for crazy.
no, with the mouse.
Just the mouse.
Here we go. All right. So, am I good to go? All right. In looking for a topic for this, I really struggled at first because I felt so fixated on something. Because about a year ago, when I was looking through my degree audit, looking for classes to take, I had the option to take 2 semesters of Java or 2 semesters of C#, as I'm sure most of us did. And back then, I'd heard of both, sure, but in the end, oh yeah, C#, that's what they use in Unity. Let's go with that. And that was about the extent of my decision making. And it was usually really uncharacteristic for me because I usually like to put a little more thought into these kind of decisions. And especially recently, I was looking for an internship at the beginning of October or so. And so I was looking through them and I found O'Reilly. Oh, they have this great internship. It's a MSU next semester. Let's try for this. And as I'm going through and getting the emails, I get, here's our coding assessment. I'm getting so excited and I open the email and I'm checking it. And at the bottom, like, here are the 2 resources you can use. And I click on them and I'm like, these are in Java. And my heart just sank. I started to think, did I make a mistake? I never put this much thought into why I chose C# and was this the correct decision? So I was looking for some way I could assuage these fears. And I thought, well, what if I were to graduate this semester right now and look for a job? Would I come out of this feeling like I can do this? Or would I feel like, maybe I should start looking at other languages? So I had to choose what companies to focus on because there's obviously a number of ways with this. And I decided to focus primarily on Springfield because for both me and I'm sure most of us, there's a good chance we'll work somewhere in Springfield, and one of these companies might be relevant to us. And I chose Jack Henry.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt for a
Yeah.
second? Were you here last week for our guest speakers?
Yes, and I'm gonna.
Okay, I just wanted to make
Yeah.
sure.
And obviously, Jack Henry is a bit of an easy thing here, but I needed a control group. I needed to say, okay, this company, I know this is C#. I know this will give us, I didn't want to pick a bunch of companies. Oh, none of these use C#. This is going to be bad. I had to make sure I had a little bit of everything. But along with Bass Pro, O'Reilly, these are some of the 3 biggest companies in Springfield. Multi-billion-dollar in the case of Bass Pro and O'Reilly for sure. It's very easy to get a job here because they also have very large tech industries, and they can, on top of just being one of the biggest employers, they employ very large tech fields. And of course, other reasons. There's also easier to get information about these. So first, Jack Henry, our control group, so to speak. I wanted to see, what could I find here and try to find patterns to the other companies. One of the things I noticed was that we all know that they use C#, but in most of their job listings, it doesn't explicitly say no C#. C# is our language. For the most part, it was actually very generic. And again, with O'Reilly, I saw this as well. But they give a list of languages, most of which are C-based, and that these companies, especially the bigger ones, they tend to be open to these other languages because they'll train you into the position. And while that seemed to be mostly specific to these larger companies, it actually helped me a lot think, okay, if these companies are willing to accept all these other languages as a valid experience, then that might help a lot. And it showed the start of a trend, which was SQL. Every single company, no SQL, we care about this. I guess I should have predicted that, but it made me, especially with all the work we're doing in SQL right now, it really helped me think, okay, maybe if C# itself is not a language I end up using at whatever company, the experience I had with SQL is going to help tremendously. And with O'Reilly, this one was a big one for me because obviously I wanted to make sure that I hadn't made a mistake. I was looking into it, and it turns out that their internships are very generic and that they want to train you in so that you can eventually work at the company. And they value these languages, as I've said. And again, SQL came up big, yet again, and Bass Pro. Well, I had to get some bad news, and of course, Bass Pro, as far as all the listings I could find, C# was nowhere to be found. RPG, or Peggle, I've actually never heard of that one. And all these, they have Java and JavaScript at the end, but for the most part, they also had the fewest Java options and whatnot. So Bass Pro might not have been the best to go through, but again, they did reference SQL. And then let's look at smaller companies. Okay, well, if I don't want to go for a big company, would I still have options in smaller ones? And actually, as far as, just general, I did mostly searches through LinkedIn and Indeed. I was cross-referencing, try to find all the listings I could. I actually found quite a few for, I'd never heard of these companies, but Worldwide Technology primarily was C#. And they said, they were the only company I found that said, we need C#, and they didn't list any other languages. I got some of the job descriptions, what they said. One of the most interesting things was from Worldwide Technology, be willing to work on a variety of projects and then different platforms, but also in a variety of languages. And so in conclusion, what I started to notice was that, I shouldn't look at myself, and I guess we all shouldn't look at ourselves as C# programmers, that that's all we're going to be good for, that we've wasted all this time in this one language, because it's so, especially as a C-based language, it translates so well into all these other languages. These companies, if they don't explicitly say we use C#, they say we look at this language and we value it. Same with SQL. And every single company, had some mention of SQL. And so again, if I were to stop right now, look for a job, I actually came out of this feeling like, you know what, I think it'd go all right. And then with O'Reilly, I'm hoping that it goes well. I've taken the coding assessment since then. I felt pretty good about it. They had a drop down. It's not just Java. You can choose whatever language you're comfortable with. And that was nice. But yeah,
So you were able to understand it
yeah.
pretty well.
I mean, the references were in Java, but yeah. So yeah, I came out of it pretty positive. Any questions? Yeah.
I was kind of looking when you were talking about some of those smaller companies, and it looked like they were saying they not only wanted you to know a bunch of different languages, but they also wanted you to be able to work on different projects, desktop, mobile, database. I don't know, just someone I heard talking about looking for a job, just to look out for. They said, look out for companies that are doing that, because that means they're looking to hire one person to do multiple people's jobs. So that's kind of a trade point where they don't really know what they want, but they just want to hire a tech person and
Yeah.
have them do everything. So that is something you might want to look out for.
Yeah, and as I was looking at it, I figured a reason that was the case because these smaller companies, they don't have multiple departments to fit people into. So they probably can't afford to have, this is our mobile app development crew, this is our this crew. So I mean, they're probably limited in terms of scope of what they can afford to do there. And it kind of makes sense, and I could definitely see that being the case, that you do get caught doing most things. But,
Watch out for that. If you work for a company that says we want you to jump from, change hats,
Mhm.
that means, do you ever want to be home on the weekends? The answer is no. You will work 24 hours a day, they'll burn you out, throw you away. And that is a tough life.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, I worked for companies like that. And I walked home one day, I came home one day after being gone for 2 weeks, and I said, who's that kid? She goes, that's your youngest.
All right.
When did we get that one?
Really good. I liked it, right? I think that was a good follow-up too, I guess, because I was just worried you hadn't been, I can't remember if he was here or not. Really good. Okay.
Next. All right. I have to get this presentation to you. Oh, I have to get. No. I have to share my screen. There you go. And is there a way for me to remote control that?
Yeah, there's a button at the top of your screen that you press.
Austin, let me know when No, it's not letting me do it yet.
Top.
Request remote control. All right. Now I have to use.
And click the mouse, and then that thing will work if you want it. It doesn't matter.
Oh, the heck. Okay, good. All right, so my name is Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about audio synthesis and virtual instrument creation with C#. The examples are going to be creating basically a 3-oscillator synthesizer because that's the basis for audio synthesis and creating samples, sample playback. So first off, I want to go over a little bit of the history of samplers. So back in the 80s and 90s, this started with, well, we had 2 options. For synth sounds or really cheesy sounds, the Commodore 64 was one of the first. And then you also have the Fairlight CMI, and I'll get into these 2 a little bit here in 1 second. So the Commodore 64 was built in 1982, and it was notable for the inclusion of its SID sound chip. It had 3 channels of synthesis. It was the first to ever do it. And actually today, this is basically the basis for, how you have like in Windows, you have those default sounds that you can hear like piano and stuff. It all started from this. So you can even download the sounds today and try to, as like a plugin basically. I actually have a Commodore 64 library and it sounds awesome. And this was basically the basis for that. Or then you had another option back in the 70s and 80s, or 80s and 90s. 1979, the Fairlight CMI was built, and this had several versions that was produced into the 90s. And it had advanced sample playback, such as timpani or a real choir sound. It also acted as a digital audio workstation, and these things costed around $10,000. 2 of these were actually used in the Terminator 2 score. So today they go about 15 grand. They are still in popularity, even though they sound really cheesy. There's something special about the playback on it. But that's what we had in the 70s and 80s. But nowadays, our computers have gotten better with RAM. We've got more powerful CPUs. So it's possible to create more realistic playback with advanced GUIs like Contact 5 or 1 second. I'm gonna go to synthesis. So let's talk about synthesis in C# really quick here. So this is going to be the GUI. And what you're seeing here is we have 5 different wave types, okay? And these 5 different wave types, there's 3 oscillators, and they have 4 radio buttons. In this example, there's actually 5, and these are based off of the synthesizer waveforms. These are standard synthesizer waveforms. You have sine wave, you have saw wave, you have triangle wave, square wave, and then a noise wave, which can be white noise or pink noise. We also have a frequency slider here. And this is going to control the hertz at which the frequency of each oscillator, and plus we have to have a mixing knob for the volume. This is you can mix the sound. Down here is a canvas that is going to graph the picture of the wave, but with a play button. So to generate each oscillator, this was the code for it. So that is going to generate 3 of those. So to create the wavetable, so the wavetable is being scaled on the x-axis, and it is being scaled also at the frequency of 44,100 samples per second. Now, why do we need it at 44,100? Well, if you go anything higher than that, let's say we want to go to 128 or 96, you're going to start making the sound like Darth Vader. It's going to slow down the sample playback. If you go any slower than 44,100, you're going to start making it sound like it's sounding like it's from Alvin and the Chipmunks. It's going to increase the rate at which it's being sampled at. So 44,100 is where, when it comes to audio playback, you want to keep it at that. The sound file that it's going to be transferred into is a 16-bit INT floating, is an array of 16-bit INT floating point numbers between -1 and 1. And that is so it can get plotted on the graph. So in order for us to be able to even play the sound, we have to use something called direct sound. That's a part of Windows DirectX library. And what that will do is it will set the buffering rate automatically for you, or you will set the buffering rate, and it automatically for you, it will wrap that into WAV format. Can you do it manually? Yes. I looked at some code online, and let's just say it is very lengthy. This simplifies things for you. So if you're looking at converting sounds, use direct sound. So let's look over the generation of audio data. So we have 3 oscillators, and then we're going to take for each sample that's going to be in those oscillators, we're then going to average the samples from it, and then we're going to go to a class called mixed data. And that's going to, and each oscillator, depending on its wave type, will go into a new array of data. So this is what the mixing class setup would look like. This is the example that I followed. And you guys can get a good look at that. This is the code then to generate the oscillator data. So basically what we're going to do then is so then we have here, let's see. Can you guys see this? Okay. I think everybody has on it. Okay, so basically this is a switch case for each radio button. So what this is going to do is going to take the number of samples based on the frequency, and then there's a bunch of math functions here that it's going to use, and then it's going to convert that to an INT62 and then push that into a array. Whoops. And then here's another one for sawtooth. Sawtooth is a little bit more complicated, and that's due to the angle of the wave type. And unfortunately, I might have to scroll in a little bit there, so you guys can see this. So I actually wanted to talk about that really quick here. It has to be in something called an array short. And what an array short is it's an array of 16-bit INTs.
the specific reason for that is when we have to graph it onto the canvas, WPF's polyline does not like anything outside of 16-bit INT. I was playing around with this, and if you go 32-bit, it'll accept it, but it gets really buggy. So you want to make sure if you're trying to graph anything is to keep your INTs in 16-bit. So that is the reason why we have something called short on there. Can I scroll back? Thank you. And then we have a switch case for the noise here, which is again the same thing. It's pretty much the same thing on every single one of them. So then we have to initialize the format information and buffer in the window loaded event handler. So basically then what we're doing is, setting our bits sample to 16, blocks the line of 4, okay. I'm sorry. Let's see here. So then what we're going to do is that's the code for the click button. So again, we're going to convert everything to the short array from our mixer class. And then, okay. So here we are. This is for the WPF's polyline, which is basically a graphing tool that Microsoft provides. So what we're basically doing here with the arrays is you're using the short INTs because you need something that represents an X coordinate and a Y coordinate, all right? And that's going to determine the angles and curvatures of the graph that you're trying to display on canvas. Now, I even found out with it that you can use something called Z coordinates. Now, Z coordinates is for displaying or trying to measure a three-dimensional space. So theoretically, you could actually create a reverb unit with this, or even a delay effect with the Z coordinates. But for this case, we're going to only use an X and a Y coordinate because we're just trying to plot graph values. So that is how you do that with this. I can scroll back. Oh, I just mentioned that actually in the slide. Oops. So basically, in the end, what I showed you here was a okay functioning synthesizer. There is it does not have an ADSR filter, which is basically called an attack, decay, sustain, and release. That is found on every synthesizer. It's not provided in this example, and I actually looked up some code online to do that. It's quite tedious. There's something called an LFO that's found on them. That's called low oscillating frequency. So it's a little pulse effects you hear underneath it. That's a bunch of code right there by itself. There's no delay, which I just talked about, which is Z coordinates, three-dimensional spaces, chorus, which is like a colorizer. So think about that. You're adding color to a sound, or an arpeggiator, which is basically you can sequence like 16 notes, 32 notes. None of that's involved in this. And most importantly, there's no MIDI input. You guys, anyone know here what MIDI is? Does anyone know? MIDI basically is, think of having a keyboard and you're pressing a note. Okay, now you should be able to hear that playback. Well, you can't with this. There's a specific reason why in this example we can't. Well, most of the libraries most of the samplers that have been built were built around C++. It's been the main coding language for 30 years. It's been the dominant language. I mean, one of the industry standard digital workstations called it Cubase. Whole thing's built in C++. So there's a lot of pre-built libraries that already do most of the functions that I listed off. Now, can you do it in C#? Yes, you have to convert all the libraries from C++. It's quite a tedious task. Well, I actually found out there's a group on GitHub. But these guys they're called Visual Studio Technology for .NET. So what they are doing is they're actually transitioning all the libraries from C++ to C#. And they even have another GitHub repository. They've been doing this for about 5 years now that is specifically for the MIDI input. So that way you can take data from your keyboard run it through your form, and you'll be able to hear a sound that's specific to the note you played. So you can play it at C0, you can play it at C4, any of those notes. So that is their repository. I recommend you go and check them out. They're making a lot of progress. I've even donated a couple dollars to them for their efforts. And hopefully with their efforts, they can actually start getting a couple libraries made that you can start coding with to make these samplers or synthesizers. So, any questions?
So you're saying, like, if I get a synthesizer and I'm, you know, adjusting knobs and playing notes,
Yep.
there's like under that there's C++ going on,
Yes.
modulating.
Yes, it's all scripted through C++. Now, that's the whole point is C# does not have those capabilities yet. Again, it's very new. No one ever thought about it until recently. I started seeing forum posts saying, you know, hey, why can't we do this in C#? And everyone said, well, no one does it because the libraries are already built. So now there's this effort going around with these guys, like I said, Visual Studio for .NET, or Virtual Instrument for .NET. They're trying to transition all these libraries so that way you can actually do it in C# and make it a lot more simpler.
So it seems like you have a lot of knowledge about this. I was wondering if you have experience with virtual instruments outside of this project.
Yeah, I do composition in a workstation. I use virtual samplers called Contact 5. And what they do is they have something called sample playback. This is if you guys want to, you can download the software and just look at its interface. It's really advanced what these guys have set up in place. To do the scripting and everything, you can take if you just get a microphone, you can record samples, bring it in and script it, and it will actually play back. You can play it on a note. You can actually have something called a round robin, which after so many notes, it'll actually play a different file. And that's all the scripting that they've made. Now, again, it's all in C++, but you can do it possibly with C# if we transition it. What I showed here in code was something extremely simple. Imagine a synthesizer that's from here to here, all the way up to here in size with 16 oscillators that can do hundreds of different things. That's a pretty big process. That's a pretty big project right there, you would think, right? So that's why they have these pre-built libraries in C++. But the idea is if we can get them transferred, it's a possibility that we could do it in C#. Yeah.
What would the advantage of doing it in C#?
Well, okay, C++ happens to be a little bit more complicated with its code. To do like a simpler function, it does require a lot more code. Now, there is certain things that's nice about it. During the middle of a line of code, from what I've seen and what people have told me, is that you can actually break it in the middle of doing something, like not just like an if statement, like in the middle of a line of code, you can just break it. So that's where C++ might have some advantages on it. But if we can somehow get that to transition over, you get what I'm saying?
Right, just be simpler.
Yeah, simpler.
And it's also a good tool. So, I mean, if you have a hammer with a claw, is a much more versatile tool than a hammer without.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of briefly skipped or went over formats. What exactly is a format?
What's that? A format?
Formats or something. You had a few slides back in a really big.
What are you talking about? Exactly a format?
Or
That's polyline. Tell me where to stop.
yeah, I'm watching. Oh, I thought it said formats.
No, it's a format basically what you're
Oh,
doing. So you're trying to format the audio data essentially to the general specifications. You always wanted that 44-100, 2 channels. Again, for the WPF polyline, you wanted that 16-bit samples, and then you have the average bytes per second, which is at 7. Actually, I have no clue what that even is down there. I'm still trying to figure that out. If someone could actually explain that to me, that would be very nice. But
Average byte per second.
yeah,
That would be how fast you want that thing to go.
Okay.
That's how fast it's moving, and you're taking samples as it's moving.
Okay. And that makes more sense then. I wasn't understanding that line. I got the rest of it.
That's why it doesn't pick up my voice, because I don't know, it's something about the sampling algorithm, so that would be really cool for me to
My-
experiment with, because I have so much trouble with that.
Yeah, you know what, that actually, it also might have to do with the quality of so some microphones have it really advanced where it can just pick up anything, anywhere. Specific, like they have microphones when they're sampling something that are just specific for a specific sound. So you have something called an ambient mic, that is to pick up the ambience after the hit, let's say on a tight go. You hit that, and it'll just pick that sound up specifically. And then you have others that are for the impact. So it depends on the microphone you're having. That might be the reason why you're having an audio issue, is that it's picking up too much ambience around the room and not specifically to the mic close to your voice.
It can also be that somebody glued it improperly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
Glued it improperly.
it
If
could
you've
just
got
be that I
anything
speak
on
wrong.
the, what do you call that stuff? The thing that.
Mhm.
Oh, come on, you guys, I have the great big giant fancy boom mic. I have my little teeny webcam mic. I've tried mic after mic after mic. It's a sampling issue. It is not hardware. Except for the hardware of my voice. It just doesn't work right. That was really interesting. Give him a hand.
Thank you.
Interesting. Keegan, are you ready?
Yeah.
Let's try to get Keegan's in, and then I think we'll.
I think I'm still sharing.
Do you want to get your good going? It's like, oh no, I have to.
Yeah, it was snowing on my way.
Do I?
That was 20 minutes.
I stopped.
That
before
does,
that.
yeah.
I stopped 20 minutes. It was very interesting. No, you weren't 20 minutes.
Thank you. Sorry, I stuttered a little bit. I wasn't exactly prepared 100% for this.
It's very interesting.
I honestly thought this was so important. Well, you look at that speech technique.
Yes.
So it's my presentation on how C# has stayed relevant. When I first started to learn programming, I struggled with which language to start with. Everyone would just say, just pick one, but I wasn't okay with that answer. I felt like I needed direction. Doing that, I learned a lot about dead languages, which was interesting to me, that a language could just not be used anymore after a few years. So when we got this project, I wanted to kind of talk about how you don't let your language die and you stay relevant. So we all know C#, we're in C#2. It's a really impressive object-oriented language. It was mainly early 2000s, and 20 years later, it's the language that most people are learning. Something that's the 5th most popular language as of 2019. And it was made essentially just so that it could rival Java. It was developed in 2000, released in 2002. Developer for Microsoft by the name of Anders Ellsberg created the language. Sun, who was later bought by Oracle, wouldn't really let Microsoft make a lot of changes to Java, so they made their own language. So it was pretty bare bones whenever it came out. It had stuff like classes, structures, everything like that. But some big things that it didn't have that people really wanted was built-in async and link, which I've fallen in love with in our recent projects and stuff. It's a really useful tool. Huh?
What?
Async.
Oh.
But C#, but if you look at today, it's like a staple for most businesses, especially in Springfield. A study done by Course Reports, who kind of look at boot camps and what people are learning and how it helps people. They found that C#
that developers who learn C# were far more likely to get jobs as developers right after graduation. And then to look at how C# has kind of been able to do that, one big reason for that is its ease of understanding. It's a very simple language to learn and read. For example, when you see something like console.writeLine, it's kind of easy. It's probably going to write a line to the console. It also has concepts that you would see in the real world, like as functions. Functions obviously do things, kind of like a car's function is to get you from point A to point B quickly. So like a function to calculate taxes is probably going to calculate taxes. So just doing that has made it, along with like handling memory management, has made it really simple to pick up and learn. The biggest reason, though, it has been able to stay relevant is that it's always evolving. In this industry, like every year, there's like new big innovations with technology and programming languages. So C# has been able to keep up and evolve, and languages that can't do that will eventually fade out. And the fact that it's supported and developed by Microsoft gives it a huge advantage already, because you get that Microsoft money to keep it updated. So looking at some different versions, 2.0 came along with things like generics, which is used a lot today. If you look at Stack Overflow, you see generics used all the time. It was a huge innovation to the language, and the ability to just wait to dictate the specifications of the types later on was just better. C#3 brought stuff like lambda expressions. 5.0 brought async finally to the language. 6.0 brought string interpolation, which I use constantly now and has been a huge just quality of life change. And then today, C#7 is the most recent version we have. It was released in 2017. And C# has just done a lot to evolve and keep up, but it's still not even done. Looking at the future of it, C# 8.0 has some really cool stuff coming. The most popular things I've seen were like lightweight classes called records, which I'm kind of excited for, and like default interface implementations, which is pretty interesting. So just kind of in conclusion, this language that was just made to rival Java has become one of the most used languages today. If you learn C#, you're more likely to be hired in the business field just because it's used so much. It has also just been able to continuously evolve thanks to Microsoft's endless resources, and evolution has been the key to keeping the language alive and probably won't be going anywhere anytime soon. Any questions?
Did you see any, as you were researching, I know Java came out with a new release not too long ago. Did you see a lot of excitement about that? It seems to me like you don't hear much about those things anymore.
I mean, I haven't, whenever I see stuff like recommended to me online, it's always C# because that's what I researched most, I think. But I don't really see a lot of Java stuff.
When I first started teaching here 5 years ago, when you would search, every example that you would find on Stack Overflow would be in Java. And now it seems like they're all switching. So I don't know what that means. It's just interesting to see this change happen. Seeing it. You guys are in the right place.
Yeah. I think the reason for it is we haven't did this 6-month cadence thing. So every 6 months they release a brand new version of Java. So it makes the old version basically outdated.
Everybody just, it's kind of hard, you know, to keep up.
Instead of just releasing an update for a version that's currently out, they release a brand new version every 6 months.
And so it's hard to run like online classes with 40 people out there who won't listen and all have all these different pieces. You know, I mean, it doesn't matter how specific of instructions you put. There's so many options.
What I love most about Java is when you're in a hurry, you want to get something done. We're upgrading Java
Yeah.
now. Walk
Oh,
away
now
from
we're
your
gonna
machine.
update this thing and that thing, and nothing works. And C# was that way too for a really long time. I mean, you know, there were a lot of problems.
But it's frustrating when you're sitting at your computer. Java comes up and says, close all your applications, we're going.
You know, and actually this morning, Keegan's right on top of things. C# 8.0 is out.
Oh,
And if you install Visual Studio 2019 in the latest update, you'll get C# 8.0. And the stuff that we got shown this morning by the student that did a presentation on the new options are, there's a really abbreviated switch case statement where you take out all of the keywords and you just have up at the top, it says something like, say you're going to do this switch case statement on a variable named var, and it's an integer. It says int var within parentheses, and then your opening and closing curly braces, and all of your case options are just listed with a lambda expression pointing to what you want that to do. So
Java did introduce that in Java 13.
exactly. It's a Java structure.
So it's like Java did it first, then C# did it.
It's that same thing.
Is break still required?
Huh?
Is the break still required?
No.
Well, how does
No, but it's got like an underscore is the default.
So it's just syntactic sugar then.
Aha.
It works the exact same way, it's just nicely laid out.
What if you want to do A and B?
Works the exact same way as a home switch case statement, it's just laid out differently.
Yeah, you just have to put them together before your lambda arrow thingy.
Oh, do A and B and then
It's not different.
It's just
Different.
Any more questions for Keegan? We'll just sit him up there in the front forever. I like it.
What did you do?
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
I Googled cringy C# jokes.
Oh, yeah, you didn't like that one.
That's good. My favorite is that one where is the C++ one. Have you not seen that?
No.
You guys will have to find that tonight. That'll be your
Because
homework.
they did C#.
Huh?
Because they did C#.
No, this one is oh, do you remember the very first Raiders of the Lost Ark where that guy is flashing around and in the end Jones pulls out his gun and shoots him?
Oh yeah.
It's like that, only it's C++ in Java. It's very cute. So, I think we're done. Yay! Great. Okay. On the hand, everybody does. All right, that puts us at about halfway. So let's leave it there so you guys can get home, hopefully, before it gets even worse. What's it looking like?
Whenever,
Oh, it's bad.
Oh, it's
Oh,
thankfully nothing is sticking to the road, so I can't.
no, the MoDOT's not disagreeing with you there.
Update 2 hours.
I was having an issue.
No, we'll do that.
All of Springfield is now covered. Be careful, be careful.
Why did we do that to your system?
We'll have
I just shut that. I didn't want to. I was trying to just treat it. So I will send it to you. And you can just translate it to C#. Sound good?
Yeah. Put it at the beginning of the end.
I guess.
Yeah.
Or I can translate it.
Your beginning joke.
I don't know, wherever you want to get. Well, actually, I gotta go home and set
You guys be careful.
I was excited to get the certification because I did not know the cross-platform development.
I am sorry. Make you wait.